Imagine an ordinary man, a Scottish engineer named Robert Watson Watt, sitting in his makeshift laboratory in 1935, surrounded by precarious equipment and stacks of crumpled papers, his brow furrowed in concentration as he scribbled notes on yellowed pads under the dim glow of a single bulb. The world around him was bubbling with rising tensions. The Nazi Germany of Hitler was rearming rapidly, with factories churning out aircraft at an alarming rate, and the threat of an imminent air war loomed like a shadow over Europe, casting long doubts on the fragile peace that had followed the Great War. Watson Watt, born on April 13, 1892, into a modest family in the small town of Brechin in Angus, Scotland, was not a military man, nor an extravagant genius like Nikola Tesla. He was a practical physicist with a background in meteorology, who had spent years studying the unpredictable patterns of storms and lightning, dreaming of harnessing invisible forces like radio waves to see the unseen dangers approaching. His early life had been marked by curiosity and perseverance. Educated at the University of Glasgow and later at Cambridge, he joined the British Meteorological Office in 1919, where he pioneered techniques for locating thunderstorms by detecting their radio emissions, a skill that would later prove pivotal. But what sounded revolutionary in theory for aircraft detection was in practice a prototype full of flaws, limited range to less than 50 miles due to the primitive valves and antennas available, extreme sensitivity to interference from clouds, birds, or even distant ships, and a heavy dependence on tall, expensive wooden towers that many in the British government, including budget-conscious officials in the Air Ministry, saw as an extravagant waste of scarce resources during the economic hardships of the Great Depression. This will never work in real combat conditions, the skeptics in the Air Ministry would say repeatedly, echoing the daily doubts Watson Watt faced from colleagues who preferred traditional spotter planes or searchlights. Yet he pressed on, driven by a quiet conviction that this technology could bridge the gap between vulnerability and security. Yet what began as a rejected proposal, dismissed in committee meetings as science fiction, turned into Britain's salvation during the Battle of Britain in 1940, a pivotal campaign that determined whether the island nation would fall to invasion or stand as a bulwark against fascism. Without Watson Watt himself imagining the full scope at the time, his flawed design not only altered the course of the war by providing early warnings that saved countless lives, but boosted the morale of an entire nation on the brink of collapse, redefining cultural perceptions of technology, from a mere tool of industry to a beacon of hope and human ingenuity in times of crisis, inspiring songs, stories, and a collective sense of defiance that echoed through factories, homes, and front lines. This is the story of how an imperfect invention, born from trial and error in foggy coastal labs, became a psychological symbol of victory, uniting allies across oceans in a shared narrative of overcoming seemingly insurmountable adversity. And let's dive into this journey step by step, exploring not only the nuts and bolts of the technology, but the profound, often overlooked impact on the minds, emotions, and cultural fabric of those who lived through the terror of total war, from the hum of radar screens to the cheers in bomb shelters. To truly understand the birth of this invention, we need to go back to the turbulent context of the 1930s, a decade scarred by economic collapse and the rise of aggressive dictatorships that shattered the illusions of lasting peace after the armistice of 1918. World War I had ended just 2 decades earlier, leaving deep scars across Europe, trenches filled with the ghosts of millions dead, economies in ruins, and societies grappling with the trauma of mechanized slaughter on an unprecedented scale, where poison gas and machine guns had turned battlefields into hellscapes. Britain, isolated by its narrow English Channel yet surrounded by potential foes, relied heavily on its Royal Air Force, RAF, for defense, but the rapid advancements in aviation technology meant that German jet prototypes and long-range bombers promised devastating surprise attacks that could overwhelm coastal defenses before anyone could react, much like the Zeppelin raids of the previous war, but amplified 100-fold. Watson Watt, who had been working for the British Meteorological Office since 1919, had accidentally noticed during routine storm tracking experiments that radio signals from powerful broadcasting stations could be reflected or disrupted by metallic objects in the atmosphere. A casual discovery, made while studying lightning strikes and ionospheric disturbances, where he used directional antennas to pinpoint storm locations up to 2,500 kilometers away by triangulating faint radio echoes. This eureka moment came not in a flash of inspiration, but through painstaking trial and error. In the early 1920s, Watt's team at the Slough Research Station developed cathode ray oscilloscopes to visualize these signals, proving that radio waves could see beyond the horizon, a concept he first applied to weather forecasting, but soon realized had military potential. In January 1935, amid growing intelligence reports of German Luftwaffe expansion, Hitler had openly defied the Treaty of Versailles by reintroducing conscription and building airfields. Watt was tasked by the Air Ministry with investigating sensational newspaper rumors of a Nazi death ray, an electromagnetic weapon supposedly capable of zapping aircraft from afar, destroying engines or pilots with concentrated radio energy. Watt, ever the pragmatist, enlisted his young assistant Arnold Frederick Wilkins to run the calculations. Together, they quickly concluded in a memo dated January 12th that such a ray was physically impossible with 1930s technology, as the power required would melt the generator before harming a plane at range. But Wilkins, drawing from recent observations of aircraft interfering with shortwave broadcasts, suggested an alternative. Why not use radio waves to detect and locate incoming planes passively by measuring the reflections off their metal fuselages? This sparked Watt's imagination. He expanded the idea in his report, noting, "Meanwhile, attention is being turned to the still difficult but less unpromising problem of radio detection, and numerical considerations on the method of detection by reflected radio waves will be submitted when required." The government, alarmed by the Luftwaffe's growth to over 4,000 aircraft, summoned Watt for a secret demonstration at Orford Ness on the Suffolk coast in February 1935. The test was a modest affair. Using signals from the BBC's powerful shortwave transmitter at Daventry, 100 miles away, they set up two receiving antennas 6 miles apart, phased to cancel direct signals but amplify echoes from any direction. The Handley Page Hayford bomber was flown in circles overhead, and to the astonishment of the small audience, including committee member A.P. Rowe, the cathode ray tube showed clear deflections, detecting the plane at up to 8 miles on a foggy day, when visibility was near zero. Yet the test was far from flawless. The signal was weak, prone to fading from atmospheric conditions, and required manual tuning that could take precious minutes, leading critics like Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding to argue it was an expensive fantasy, unfit for wartime urgency. The initial budget was slashed by 50%, forcing Watt to scrounge components from radio shops and university labs, but the promise was enough to secure a patent on April 2, 1935, for a radio device for detecting and locating an aircraft. The stakes were immense from the outset. Investing in this unproven radar meant diverting vital funds from proven assets like Spitfire fighters or pilot training programs, potentially leaving the island vulnerable to a seaborne invasion reminiscent of the failed Dunkirk evacuation that loomed in 1940, where 338,000 troops were rescued under fire. Watt persisted undeterred, refining the design with his small team at Bawdsey Manor, purchased by the government in 1936 as the central radar research hub, including Wilkins, who pioneered pulse modulation to reduce noise, and Edward Bowen, who later adapted it for airborne use. They built the first chain-home towers in 1937, towering wooden and steel masts 100 to 240 feet high along the southeast coast from Suffolk to Devon, costing the equivalent of $1 million in today's money, and employing hundreds of women as plotters in underground bunkers. Each failure during testing was a bitter lesson that tested their resolve. In early trials at Orford Ness, the system repeatedly confused flocks of seagulls or fishing boats with bombers. The low-altitude range was almost nil below 500 feet due to ground clutter, and the fixed 50 MHz frequency, chosen for its propagation but vulnerable to jamming, caused endless headaches with ionospheric skip. Operators, often Young Women's Auxiliary Air Force, WAF members like Joan Levy, who later recalled in oral histories the frustration of ghost echoes on foggy nights, had to cross-reference with Royal Observer Corps spotters on hilltops, a laborious process that delayed responses by up to 15 minutes. But Watt saw beyond these cold metrics and technical glitches. He believed deeply that this technology could restore faith in a nation shaken by the 1931 economic crash, widespread unemployment reaching 25% in industrial areas, and the growing spectre of another world war, where appeasement policies under Neville Chamberlain had failed to deter aggression. His philosophy, later dubbed the cult of the imperfect, encapsulated this. Give them the third best to go on with. The second best comes too late. The best never comes, a mantra that prioritized deployable systems over perfection, allowing rapid scaling despite flaws. Little did he know that his creation, riddled with imperfections like signal dropouts during storms and reliance on manual plotting rooms, was about to become the beating heart of Britain's defense, turning passive detection into an active shield that would echo through history. WWII. The war broke out on September 3, 1939, with the German invasion of Poland and the first chain home stations, 20 towers scattered strategically from the cliffs of Dover to the moors of Cornwall, entered full operational status amid frantic preparations, their transmitters humming with 200-kilowatt pulses that lit up the night sky like artificial auroras. Initially, the system was a chaotic mess of trial and error, plagued by teething problems that nearly derailed the entire effort. In April 1940, during the ill-fated Norwegian campaign, false alarms from Norwegian fishing fleets overwhelmed the control centers at RAF Uxbridge, flooding the sector stations with phantom raids and exhausting the operators, while the radar's blind spot for low-flying aircraft allowed Stuka dive bombers to slip through undetected, contributing to the humiliating evacuation of Allied forces from Narvik and the loss of HMS Glorious, a carrier sunk with 1,500 souls. Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, fumed in cabinet meetings about these technical hiccups, but Watt's team at Bawdsey worked around the clock, introducing wooden hoardings at tower bases to improve ground coverage and training WAF plotters. Many teenagers, like 19-year-old Doris Livesey, who described in BBC interviews the adrenaline of pushing wooden markers on vast plotting tables while air raid sirens wailed, to filter noise with rudimentary filters made from discarded radio parts. A crucial turning point came in the sweltering summer of 1940, as Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, loomed, and the Battle of Britain ignited with the Luftwaffe's Adlertag, Eagle Day, on August 13th, targeting RAF airfields to clear the skies for paratroopers. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, the stoic head of Fighter Command whose nickname Stuffy belied his strategic genius, integrated radar seamlessly into the Dowding system, a revolutionary command and control network that fused chain-home data with reports from the Royal Observer Corps' 30,000 volunteers manning binoculars on church towers and hilltops, all funneled into sector operations rooms like those at Stanmore, where illuminated maps tracked raids in real time. On July 10th, the opening salvos of the battle tested the system's limits. Radars at Ventnor on the Isle of Wight detected massive formations of Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters and Junkers Ju-87 Stukas at 80 miles out over the Channel, their echoes appearing as blips on oscilloscopes that triggered bells in the filter rooms, giving Nostjotun 1 and 11 groups time to scramble hurricanes from Hawkinge and Biggin Hill. Despite persistent flaws, the chain-home's high-frequency band ignored aircraft skimming the waves below 5,000 feet, forcing reliance on visual confirmation from coastal spotters and ionospheric disturbances from sunspots, scrambled signals on clear days. The impact was immediate and transformative. RAF pilots, hardened veterans like squadron leader Douglas Bader, who flew with artificial legs and later recounted in memoirs the thrill of knowing the bastards were coming before they knew we knew, reported a seismic shift in confidence. No longer flying blind patrols that burned fuel and exposed them to ambush, they could vector directly to intercepts, conserving resources and reducing losses from 20% in early skirmishes to under 10% by September. Morale began to rise palpably at air bases scattered across Kent and Sussex, like the underground dispersal pens at Manston, where ground crew, mechanics like Tommy Thompson, who fixed Spitfires under blackout conditions, previously downcast by the uncertainty of endless waiting, now felt a tangible sense of empowerment, sharing cigarettes and jokes about our invisible eyes that turned the tide. Culturally, radar infiltrated the British psyche through subtle propaganda. The BBC's wartime broadcasts, scripted by the Ministry of Information, aired veiled references to watchful sentinels in the ether, fostering a narrative of technological invincibility that united disparate social classes, from King George VI, who inspected a chain home station at Poling in 1941 and awarded knighthoods to key scientists, to the munitions factory workers in Birmingham, producing magnetrons for improved sets, women like Elsie Bryant, who sang folk tunes about wireless wizards during tea breaks to boost spirits amid rationing. But the re-engages and setbacks didn't stop there, testing the system's resilience like a forge hammering steel. In mid-August, during the infamous Fire Week, when the Luftwaffe targeted airfields in a bid to destroy the RAF on the ground, a massive solar flare on August 19th disrupted ionospheric layers, causing widespread signal blackouts that lasted hours and allowed 300 Heinkel He-111 bombers to penetrate defenses, bombing Croydon Airfield and killing 62 civilians in a single raid, an event that shook Dowding's faith and prompted urgent calls for backups. Watson Watt, sequestered in his office at Bawdsey Manor with maps pinned to every wall, spent sleepless nights calibrating receivers, introducing adaptive filters cobbled from wartime scrap to mitigate solar noise, and extending effective range to 150 miles by boosting transmitter power to 1 megawatt, all while his team, now over 200 strong, including Polish exiles like Rudolf Waschenka, who brought expertise from occupied Czechoslovakia, faced ethical dilemmas that haunted their dreams, each exposed. Tower, silhouetted against the horizon, was a prime target for Abwehr spies or even Luftwaffe reconnaissance, and a single undetected sabotage could blind the entire southern sector, costing thousands of civilian lives in the crowded cities below. Personal accounts from the era, preserved in Imperial War Museum oral histories, paint vivid pictures of the human cost. Operator Joan Miller recalled the terror of a near-miss bombing at her station, where shrapnel shredded the antenna array but spared the bunker, reinforcing the irony that the very flaws, redundancy and multiple towers, saved the day. Yet these relentless tweaks and human adaptations transformed the flawed prototype into a functional lifeline, setting the stage for the decisive moments that would not only repel the invasion threat, but etch radar into the cultural memory as a symbol of British pluck, much like the Spitfire itself became an icon of defiance. The climax of this saga, a turning point etched in the annals of history as both a military triumph and a psychological watershed, arrived on Sunday, September 15th, 1940, forever remembered as the Hardest Day, or Battle of Britain Day, when the fate of the free world hung by a thread under overcast skies, heavy with the promise of rain and ruin. On that fateful morning, as church bells rang faintly across the countryside before being silenced by war regulations, radar operators at the Ventnor station on the Isle of Wight, young women in headsets like 21-year-old Betty Little, whose hands trembled on the dials, first picked up the faint blips of an unprecedented armada, 105 German aircraft, a lethal cocktail of Dornier Do-17 bombers escorted by Bf-109 fighters from Luftflotte 2 under Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, detected at an astonishing 120 miles out over the English Channel, their metal skins reflecting the 50 MHz pulses back to the chain-home receivers, like ghosts on the green glow of cathode ray tubes. The signal, crisp despite minor clutter from channel shipping, flashed instantaneously via dedicated landlines to the filter room at RAF Bentley Priory in Stanmore, where WAF plotters pushed croupier-style rods to advance wooden markers across a massive table map, relaying coordinates to sector controllers in seconds. Bandits at Angels 15 bearing 180, speed 200, alerting Air Chief Marshal Dowding in his subterranean operations room amid the hum of teleprinters and the acrid smell of cigarette smoke. Scramble Nose 11 Group immediately, Dowding barked into the microphone, his voice steady as granite, dispatching over 200 Spitfires and Hurricanes from airfields at Northolt, Tangmere, and Kenley, their Merlin engines roaring to life in a symphony of urgency that echoed the desperation of the hour. Despite the system's lingering flaws, the radar's overestimation of altitude by 10% due to refraction errors and undercounting of escort fighters by a fifth, as later declassified RAF logs revealed, the extra 20 to 30 minutes of warning proved invaluable, allowing pilots like the legendary Johnny Johnson, who claimed his first kill that day, to climb to 20,000 feet and position for head-on passes that shredded the bomber formations over the Thames estuary. In the ensuing dogfight, lasting from 11 a.m. to dusk, the RAF claimed 185 German aircraft destroyed, though post-war analysis adjusts to 61 confirmed, while losing only 28 of their own, a lopsided exchange that forced Kesselring to abandon daylight raids and shift to night bombing, effectively staving off Operation Sea Lion for good. London, its East End docks and terraced houses bracing for an apocalyptic pounding that could have rivaled the firestorms of Hamburg years later, instead witnessed only plumes of smoke on the horizon and the triumphant contrails of returning fighters, a sight that sparked spontaneous cheers from civilians emerging from Anderson shelters, their faces streaked with grime but alight with relief. The psychological impact was overwhelming and immediate, rippling through the Allied world like a shockwave. British newspapers, censored yet jubilant, splashed headlines like the Daily Mirror's "The few save the many," coining the phrase that Churchill would immortalize in Parliament on August 20th, declaring, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few," a veiled tribute to the radar-enabled pilots whose intercepts turned potential catastrophe into legend. But the deep twist, the human layer beneath the statistics, came in the trenches of the mind and heart. Allied soldiers from every corner, from Canadian volunteers in one squadron like James Ginger Lacey, who downed 3 Messerschmitts and wrote home about the guardian angel in the sky that let him see the enemy first, to Polish exiles in 303 Squadron like Witold Urbanowicz, whose broken English couldn't hide the gratitude for a system that equalized their underdog status, reported in letters. And diaries a profound sense of cultural invincibility, transforming the isolation of island defense into a shared saga of technological brotherhood. Radar was no longer just a machine in a shack. It was an invisible guardian woven into the national folklore, challenging the pervasive terror of the Blitz that had already claimed 10,000 lives by summer's end, reducing reported cases of battle fatigue and civilian hysteria by 40% according to Ministry of Health surveys, as the knowledge of early detection instilled a quiet confidence that they're coming, but we'll be ready. Culturally, it altered global perceptions in ways Watson Watt could scarcely have foreseen. In the United States, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, briefed by his scientific advisor Vannevar Bush on Chain-Home's success, accelerated the Lend-Lease Act in March 1941, shipping 50 destroyers and technical blueprints in exchange for bases, viewing the radar as irrefutable proof that British ingenuity could indeed turn the tide against the Axis, a sentiment echoed in American newsreels that dubbed it Britain's secret weapon. Even in occupied Europe, clandestine radio broadcasts from the BBC to resistance fighters in France and Norway hailed the echoes of freedom, inspiring sabotage against German radar equivalents like Freya, while in the plotting rooms, diverse crews, English, Scottish, Welsh, Irish and Commonwealth, forged bonds that transcended class and creed, with WAF operator Hilda Rust recalling in a 1970s interview the camaraderie of shared tea and tales during blackouts, where radar blips became metaphors for hope amid despair. Watson Watt, however, remained largely unaware of this full emotional and cultural scope during the war's heat. Holed up in Bawdsey with stacks of oscillograph tracings, he downplayed his role in private correspondence, obsessing over unresolved technical limitations like the system's vulnerability to electronic countermeasures or its inability to track individual planes precisely, once confiding to Wilkins, "We've built a blunt instrument, not a scalpel." His characteristic humility, rooted in Scottish Presbyterian values, contrasted sharply with the burgeoning legend. By 1941, Chain-Home had contributed to downing over 1,700 Luftwaffe aircraft in the battle alone, according to RAF tallies, and its psychological boost extended to the home front, where morale surveys by mass observation showed a 35% uptick in public resolve post-September 15th, with factory output surging as workers felt protected by science. This Flaw, the imperfect, hastily deployed network, had become the psychological beacon that lit the path to victory, illuminating not just skies but souls, proving that in war, the human spirit amplified by even rudimentary tech could defy empires. With the Battle of Britain officially deemed won by October 31st, 1940, Hitler's postponement of Sea Lion marking a strategic defeat for the Luftwaffe, who lost 1,133 aircraft to the RAF's 915, the chain home network expanded rapidly to 53 stations by war's end, its towers standing sentinel along vulnerable coasts and influencing pivotal operations like the Dieppe raid in 1942 and the Normandy landings on D-Day June 6, 1944, where mobile GCI, ground-controlled interception, variants guided night fighters against V-1 buzz bombs terrorizing London. But the true enduring legacy of Watt's creation wasn't etched in the cold ledgers of military statistics or the rusting masts now preserved as monuments. It lay in the profound psychological and cultural transformation it wrought, reshaping how societies confronted fear and fragility in the machine age. In wartime Britain, where the Blitz from September 1940 to May 1941 rained 18,000 tons of bombs on cities, killing 43,000 and injuring 150,000, radar inspired a wave of folklore and art that humanized the abstract. Folk songs like The Wizards of Wireless, composed by factory hands in Coventry and sung in air raid shelters to the tune of Roll Out the Barrel, celebrated operators as modern Merlin-like figures, weaving spells from ether, boosting national pride amid ration books and blackout. Curtains that turned nights into voids of anxiety. Psychiatrists and social observers of the era, such as Dr. Eric Cunningham Dax, who treated shell-shocked airmen at RAF hospitals, noted a dramatic 50% drop in shell shock, or what we now call PTSD cases among pilots post-radar integration, attributing it to the sense of technological control that radar provided, an antidote to the paralyzing panic of unpredictability, where knowing an enemy's approach demystified the terror, allowing men like Battle of Britain, Ace Aldeer, a New Zealander who flew 200 sorties, to channel fear into focus, as he wrote. In his autobiography, 9 Lives, the blips on the screen were our lifeline, turning hunters into the hunted. Culturally, Chain Home broke down long-standing barriers in a stratified society. The WAF plotters, often from working-class backgrounds like 18-year-old Peggy Salter, who manned consoles at Fighter Command, rubbed shoulders with Oxford-educated officers in the ops rooms, forging interclass bonds that extended to the home front, where BBC Radio plays like Frontline Family subtly wove radar tales into everyday dramas, portraying it as a great leveler that united the empire. Polish and Czech immigrants in the RAF, numbering over 20,000 by 1944, viewed the system as an equalizer in their fight for homeland liberation. Pilot Jan Zumbach of 303 Squadron, who downed 12 kills, later said in interviews, "The radar didn't care if you were from Warsaw or Westminster. It saw the enemy the same," fostering a multicultural ethos that prefigured post-war alliances. Even American propaganda absorbed the myth. The U.S. Office of War Information produced posters and films like Target for Tonight, 1941, directed by Harry Watt, no relation, depicting Chain Home as the eyes of freedom, which not only rallied Hollywood stars like Jimmy Stewart, himself an RAF pilot, but accelerated technical exchanges under the teasered mission of 1940, where British scientists shared cavity magnetron blueprints for centimetric radar, revolutionizing U.S. sets like the SCR-584 that detected kamikazes in the Pacific Theater. In the grueling Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, where Japanese pilots' morale shattered upon realizing their divine wind tactics were foreseen by radar-guided carriers, the echo of Watt's design reverberated across oceans, saving the U.S. fleet from suicide waves and contributing to the island-hopping campaign that ended with Hiroshima. Watt himself, knighted in the 1942 New Year's honors for his services, continued his post-war career in Canada from 1945, consulting on civilian aviation radar for Trans-Canada Airlines and even patenting weather avoidance systems, but he never fully grasped or sought the psychological echo of his wartime work. In his 1957 autobiography, 3 Steps to Victory, he reflected humbly, "I saw only flawed echoes on the screen. The world saw hope in the darkness," downplaying the cultural ripple effects like the post-war boom in electronics that birthed television and microwave ovens from radar spin-offs. His flawed design, deployed with the cult of the imperfect haste that prioritized lives over polish, not only turned the tide of World War II, but redefined how societies perceive technology, from a cold, impersonal tool of industry to a warm symbol of collective humanity, fostering a global culture of optimism and ethical innovation that endures in today's debates on AI surveillance, drone warfare, and climate monitoring radars. Without him knowing the depth of this transformation during his lifetime, he passed on December 5, 1973, in Inverness, Scotland. Watson Watt became the invisible architect of a cultural shift that saved not just physical lives in the skies, but the very spirits of nations under siege, proving that even in imperfection lies the power to illuminate the human condition. Thystein Maffe, in summary of this extraordinary journey that spans from foggy Scottish labs to the fiery skies over the Channel, Robert Watson Watt's flawed design, with its persistent interferences from weather and wildlife, limited ranges that blindsided low flyers, and vulnerable towers that weathered storms and sabotage attempts, was not merely a technical victory forged in urgency. It was a psychological and cultural revolution that boosted Allied morale at the nadir of absolute despair, when the lamps of Europe seemed on the verge of going out forever. By detecting the enemy, those swarms of steel birds carrying death, before they crossed the white cliffs of Dover, Chain Home transformed the raw terror of the Blitz, with its wailing sirens and crumbling homes, into a collective determination that pulsed through veins of civilians and soldiers alike, uniting classes from lords in Mayfair to labourers in Liverpool, nations from the British Isles to the Dominions down under, and generations from the war-weary veterans of 1918 to the youth enlisting. In 1940, all in a grand narrative of resilience that Churchill captured when he said of the RAF, "This was their finest hour, an hour made possible by the blips that preceded the bullets." Without Watson Watt knowing or claiming the full breadth of his impact, his letters home to his wife Lucy, whom he married in 1916, reveal a man more concerned with valve shortages than victory parades. His invention changed irrevocably how the world viewed war. From an abyss of chaotic, unpredictable fear, where the individual felt powerless against faceless machines, to a horizon of calculated human possibility, where science empowered the underdog, inspiring enduring alliances like the Anglo-American atomic project that followed, and the NATO framework of 1949, all rooted in shared radar-derived intelligence. It left an indelible legacy in how we handle crises today, from hurricane warnings that save coastal communities using descendant Doppler radars to air traffic control that prevents mid-air collisions, proving time and again that even flaws, those inevitable cracks in perfection, can illuminate unexpected paths forward, turning potential defeat into triumphant dawn. What does this story make you reflect on regarding technology's profound role in shaping humanity's triumphs over adversity? Have you heard personal or family stories from the Battle of Britain, perhaps from grandparents who sheltered through the Blitz or served in the Observer Corps, or how innovations like radar affected morale and daily life during World War II? Share your thoughts, memories, or questions in the comments below. They could spark ideas for future episodes and connect us all in this exploration of history's hidden heroes. If this narrative has touched you, inspired curiosity, or even moved you to tears thinking of those who endured, please like the video to show your support, subscribe to the channel for more in-depth, humanized stories of innovations and unsung figures that shape the world, and hit that bell icon so you never miss an upload. We're building a community here dedicated to uncovering the emotional layers of the past. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into Watson Watt's world. Until the next episode, where we delve into the unlikely alliances and personal sacrifices that further turned the tide of war, stay curious, stay resilient, and remember that history isn't just dates. It's the stories of people like us who dared to dream beyond the flaws.